At issue this week, Canada and the war in the Middle East.
Ceasefire now! Fire now!
The Prime Minister confronted by angry protesters and called out by Israel's Prime Minister after these comments.
Even wars have rules. All innocent life is equal in worth, Israeli and Palestinian. I urge the government of Israel to exercise maximum restraint.
How is the government responding to the war, and how is it being received in this country and beyond? Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it down this week. Chantal Hebert, Coyne and Althia Raj, good to see you all. Chantal, I'll start with you. Did you think that the language that the Prime Minister used a couple of days ago was a shift, and was it a marked shift from perhaps what other leaders in the world are saying right now?
In substance, if you only read the transcript, probably not. If you look at the tone, you would probably think that the Prime Minister was trying to be more forceful about his warning to Israel. He did not say the words ceasefire, but he seemed to be saying that Israel was being or overstepping in some way. He seemed to imply that. And it certainly was understood by many members of the Jewish community as a statement that seemed to point the finger at Israel and by definition to encourage the acts that we've seen in this country against Jewish communities.
I think that's a really good point, Andrew, because actually we, in our newsroom, went and looked at some of the other world leaders' statements. Emmanuel Macron, for instance, said almost the same kind of language, but the tone was not the same. And it does seem as though that is perhaps what got people more exercised over what the Prime Minister said.
Yeah, and there's a context in terms of previous statements that he and his ministers have made, which do not seem to be giving Israel much of the benefit of the doubt, and that sometimes do seem to give Hamas the benefit of the doubt, which I think sticks in the craw of a lot of people on this issue. It's also, what Joe Biden says will be received rather differently in Israel than what a Canadian Prime Minister says. Mr. Biden runs the world's largest superpower. He is Israel's chief benefactor in terms of arms supplies, et cetera. So people take seriously what he has to say. I think a lot of people in Israel will be saying, well, what exactly is the reason why the Prime Minister of Canada has to weigh in at this particular moment, other than perhaps for domestic political reasons? And yes, when you take the tone and as well as the content, it seems certainly to be essentially not just blaming Israel for the deaths that are taking place in Gaza, which you could just as easily, and perhaps with more justice, turn around and say Hamas could stop this war tomorrow if it chose to. But it also seemed to be suggesting, without evidence, that Israel was guilty of war crimes. I think a larger discussion perhaps is in order on this, but simply looking at the number of deaths is not in itself evidence of a war crime. You have to look at what, with each bombing raid, et cetera, was the military value of the raid, of the attack worth were they proportional, the number of deaths to the military value of the target? And people who have looked at this closely, not everyone's in agreement on this, but certainly some experts have been saying they do not see evidence of war crimes here. So for the Prime Minister to be rather loosely suggesting that, I don't blame, frankly, Israel and its supporters taking umbrage at that. And I noticed by the next day or yesterday, he was starting to walk it back.
Althea, it does, though, point to how complicated it is for any world leader. I mean, certainly Joe Biden has more pressure than the Prime Minister here, but to the pressure that they are under to say the right thing, whatever that might be, to certain communities right now.
There is no right thing, because you can't say anything that will please either camp. And I don't view the Prime Minister's words as a message to Israel. I think and maybe I'm being a little cynical here, but I really do believe the message is directed at diaspora communities in this country. And really, this is about domestic politics and the fact that there is no real winning issue. And as the conflict stretches out and becomes longer and longer, and the death counts mount, and the fact that, this isn't World War II. There's 24-hour news cycles, and you have video footage of everything that is happening, and you have to maintain public attention and public support in a way that in past wars, you probably didn't need to do that.
Right.
You didn't need to do that. So it brings the conflict home in a way that we haven't felt in other issues. And so that's why the Liberals are struggling, and that's why their messaging is struggling. And I wouldn't be surprised to hear them actually call for a ceasefire with conditions as the weeks and months wear on. And it's not because they're giving Hamas the benefit of the doubt. They know that, it's not like these are two actual states fighting against one another, but the bar is higher on Israel because Hamas is a terrorist organization and they will do what they want to do. And Israel is a democracy that Canada feels is on the same level. And that's why it's a lopsided equation.
So if I can bring it back to something I know more about than resolving issues in the Middle East, I think this week what we saw was the beginning of this conflict moving from the streets, which have been scenes for how it's playing out in this country, to the actual House of Commons and the dynamics in the House of Commons. I think it impacts the two parties most who are party to the pact that is keeping the Liberals going. On the NDP side, the first party to call for a ceasefire, there are now MPs who are wondering whether they want to back the Liberals on confidence votes because of their refusal to call for a ceasefire. So on that basis, they're saying, we don't really want to be seen as backing this government. But on the Liberal side, I believe that there is a really dark red line within caucus over the words ceasefire, with or without conditions, unless the U.S. takes the lead and the entire dynamics changes. But I believe that the government has cause to believe that if it ever crosses that ceasefire line, it will lose members to resignations.
Except there are also people, members of that same caucus, that have published open letters calling for the Prime Minister to call for a ceasefire. So I hear what you're saying, but there are people on the other side as well.
But they have not resigned.
No, not yet.
I totally believe that if Justin Trudeau single-handedly thinks he's going to go that extra step and say, we're calling for a ceasefire, that he's going to be handed some resignations from members of his government.
But if the U.S., Andrew, does that, if that is where the world moves, then does that give him political cover in order to allow his caucus members to stick with him, the ones who may not like it?
Oh, if it's a fait accompli, yes. But I think Chantal's right that in a way he's got some cover because we have two parties left of center in Canada. So the ones who are most strident in favor of a ceasefire are to be found in the NDP. There are certainly Liberals who want a ceasefire as well. But you look, for example, at the British Labour Party, which has to cover much more of the left of center ground in one party, and they are experiencing resignations there from people who want a ceasefire. So this is roiling all of the left of center parties. There's trouble within the Democratic Party in the United States as well. The right seems a little more unified on this issue than the left is.
Last word to you, Althia.
I think it's possible. I don't believe the Canadian government will move on its own on anything that has to do with this topic.
No.
But if it moves with its allies, with Australia, with the US, with European nations, I think that may be where it goes. And I do think that the Foreign Affairs Minister, Melanie Joly, was just voicing her own opinion. I have no indication that this is like a line from the government that they wanted to express. But I think that reflects the conversations that are happening at her level. And I think that is an indication of where the ball may be going.
Okay, let's take a little break here. Thank you very much for the beginning of that conversation. When we come back, we'll take a look at the Prime Minister's polling numbers. How troubling should they be right now? How should the Liberals respond? That's next on The National. Poll after poll suggests Canadians aren't happy with the Liberal government. A new Leger poll shows almost 2 in 3 Canadians have a negative impression of the PM, and more than half of those polled think he should resign because they are, quote, tired of him. So what's been made of the PM's low polling, the government's low polling? How much of it is about what is happening in the world right now? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. Althia, why don't you start us off on this? Obviously, this is not just one poll. This is a trend. And at what point do those numbers start to cause real concern for the Prime Minister and for Liberals, knowing that the election is not around the corner?
Well, they hope the election is not around the corner.
They
but
sure
one
do.
could say it is a minority government and things may not exactly work out as they plan. I don't get the sense that it's causing anxiety or deep anxiety around the people around the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister. It is causing a lot of anxiety within the Liberal caucus, with people who are Liberals who are outside of caucus, who do not understand why the Liberals have not spent millions of dollars trying to frame Pierre Poilievre. Actually, they didn't spend millions of dollars last fall when Mr. Poilievre was elected, to try to remind Canadians what type of politicians Mr. Poilievre is. And they are still repeating these calls, and those calls are getting louder and louder. But the people around the Prime Minister suggest that he's got 2 years to go, and that is where their eye is, that they believe that people are angry because of economic conditions and that things are going to get better, and therefore it's not a great love-in with Pierre Poilievre. Yeah. And frankly, they do not have $10 million to spend on a massive ad buy to frame Mr. Poilievre. I mean, that's what they don't say, but really they don't have that amount of money. They could throw a little bit of money, but it would basically be to calm people in caucus and the naysayers outside of caucus than to actually make a dent in Mr. Pierre Poilievre's numbers. Yeah. So that's their dilemma. Their dilemma is, yes, the numbers stink, but we think our guy's not going away. And we think these are really economic numbers. And we will frame Mr. Poilievre basically closer to the election campaign when we have budgeted money for it.
Even if we were to take that as a fact, sure, like the economy stinks, people are feeling very worried and anxious about various things. They are blaming one party, and that's the government, and that's what we're seeing in the polls, Andrew. And to some extent, they are right to point the finger on some of these issues at the government.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is just about leadership. I don't think it's going to be cured by just throwing a bunch of negative ads at Pierre Poilievre. And I think it must have been dismaying to some Liberals that last or a week ago Abacus poll that suggested, on the one hand, that the Prime Minister's numbers were certainly dragging the party down, but on the other, that if he went, it wasn't going to necessarily save them. So that is a conundrum. I think it's a combination of things. Again, looking at some of the polling data, that there does seem to emerge from a lot of these polls that people don't feel that the Liberals have a plan, quote unquote, on a lot of these issues, that they seem much more interested in their own kind of hobby horse issues than some of the kind of meat and potatoes issues, the economy, housing, et cetera, that seem to be more on people's minds. I think these polls have gotten their attention, and they're certainly focusing on some of these questions much more now. And I take the point that there's 2 years still to go, or at least can be 2 years still to go, and things can change. But, you know, I don't think you've seen a governing party this far behind in the polls since the last days of Brian Mulroney in the early 1990s. And you know where that all went. So, you can turn things around if you dig hard enough, but they are really in a hole at this point.
Well, that's sort of the question then, Chantal, isn't it? Can you be this far down and recover, or is it a lost cause?
Well, first, it's worth noting that this is a really tough time to be in office. If you look at the approval numbers of comparable government leaders, Joe Biden, Emmanuel Macron, Rishi Sunak, or even in this country, Premiers Ford, Legault, who used to have fairly decent numbers and have been in decline. What you see is it's really not a good time to be in government just about anywhere. That being said, I understand the comparison with Brian Mulroney, and actually he had terrible polls for the last 2 years of his second term. But there are limitations to the comparison. Up to a point, even with the same bad numbers, Justin Trudeau is still in better shape. Why? Because Brian Mulroney's numbers were based on structural issues that could not be fixed. The birth of two parties that would take away the two pillars of his coalition, the Bloc Québécois and the Reform, and the fact that the anger was not general dissatisfaction, a bit of a fuzzy, they're not doing the right things, they're too much of this. It was based on actual policies, the GST, the Constitution. There is not one lightning rod that is so specific to what's happening to the Liberals. I think the main saving grace from the Liberals' perspective in the current numbers are the numbers of the NDP. If the NDP was on a roll, their government would be facing an election much sooner than 2 years from now. But the NDP is not on a roll.
No, but it does.
I think Chantal,
go ahead. Yeah.
Chantal makes a good point, but I think you could flip it around. So there aren't big structural issues that are holding them down. There aren't big structural issues that are pushing them up either.
Yeah,
the Liberals have been in a secular decline for 2 or 3 or 4 decades, if you really look at it. They've lost the popular vote in 5 of the last 6 elections. They were really in the tank before they sort of grabbed onto the savior figure of Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
But they did so really to the exclusion of a much more searching discussion about what it means to be a Liberal Party, what's the case for a centrist party at a time when things are polarizing. And if the luster is off of Justin Trudeau, then, as it well and truly is, then all those issues come back to the fore of sort of much more existential questions of what is the reason for a Liberal Party.
Yeah, although I feel like we just had this conversation with the Conservative Party after the last election, and I guess everyone has to do some self-examination at some point. Althia, and then Chantal, then I got to go.
I think there are some structural issues, but the opportunities might be there for actually them to capitalize on current circumstances. The silver lining in that Abacus poll was that there are a lot of people who say they've parked their vote with the NDP who are willing to swing back to the Liberals would it look like Pierre Poilievre is going to win. Yeah. And if Donald Trump wins next year, then I think that's an indication that it would maybe be easier for the Liberals to make that crystallized case between the two extremes that they want to make. So obviously, how can we tell a few years down the line? But I think there are reasons for them to not be like at the bar drinking their heart out, trying to think about ways to end their lives, So it's not
we'll let them know.
It's not all doom and gloom. But there are other structural issues that we should talk about at length at another time.
Yes, we will.
The way fundraising works, like that has stretched people to be, that encourages people to be at the polar extremes, where I actually do not think the majority of Canadian voters are.
Okay, Chantal, last word to you.
Well, I'm guessing an existential question, if they want to go to that bar and think of how their life will end, is Justin Trudeau a one-off? And I'm picking up on what Andrew said.
Yeah.
Did the savior thing actually hide what is really a decline in progress? Their Liberal brand has disappeared. There is in decline everywhere in this country, west of Atlantic Canada.
Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself, did they find, because of the magic of the name, a reprieve from reality? And once they won that majority, they decided they need not look at electoral reform, for instance, because they could still win without it. But what if that was wrong? What if the exception is more the Trudeau period rather than a return to the rule when they're the natural governing party?
Yes. We have to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll look at the Liberal NDP pharmacare plan, whether it's actually going to happen. That's next. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says he doesn't expect to see much movement on pharmacare in next week's fall economic update. And he says the last draft of the legislation he saw was not good enough.
We've seen a first draft, and we made it very clear that the first draft was insufficient for our support. And so the government's taken that back and are working on some amendments.
So how likely is the NDP's wish for pharmacare? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Althia, Andrew. Andrew, why don't you start us off? I feel like this is not going to happen. I'm not going to say never, but I feel like it's not going to happen soon, or certainly not as soon as the NDP might have thought.
Well, it depends what it means. I think
fair enough.
I think there'll be a proposal. I just don't think it's going to be a full-blown, single-payer, universal pharmacare plan of the NDP's dreams. The numbers aren't there, both fiscally, the cost of the thing, depending on how you model it, it can be quite extraordinary, but also just in terms of public opinion. I don't think the numbers are there. I don't think public wants that. People who have drug plans now are not in a mood, I think, to give them up. When you ask people what their priorities are in terms of their top policies they're looking for from government, pharmacare does not rank on there. So I think for all those reasons, I don't think the Liberals are likely to cave to the NDP on this, even in their present weakened state.
So what does that mean then? If that was at the NDP convention, Chantal, one of the red lines for some MPs and for some of the members of the party, what happens then if they don't? Like, how long can they drag this out to make it look like they're about to get something that satisfies the NDP?
I'm guessing the government will give the NDP something that will look like something to build on. But on top of all the arguments that Andrew has brought forward, you can't have this, the plan that the NDP members say they want, without some provincial buy-in.
Yeah.
And if you are seeing some or a lot of it, you tell me. Because as far as I can tell, there's almost none. Maybe they can get some from the NDP provinces, but you cannot put a program like that in place without cooperation from the provinces. And this isn't childcare. No. Where you make a deal and you send money. Yeah. Provinces are going to be wary of buying in because of their experience with Medicare and the funding from the federal government that goes up or down depending on the needs of the federal government. So I'm guessing the NDP is working itself into not upping the ante too much so that it can say this is a good beginning faced with something.
I don't know what that, I guess I just don't know what that something would be then, Althia. Like, what would allow them to save face knowing that it's probably not actually going to happen for all the reasons everybody's talked about already?
Yeah, I've been struggling with that for the past couple of weeks myself, because they keep talking about, both sides say that they're cautiously optimistic and hopeful. And they keep talking about a third way, but I don't see what this third way is. It could either be they bring forward a framework that is not funded, that gives the NDP a win and doesn't hurt the Liberals' budget, but does require, or I guess you're building on something in the future, or it's a mid-system that doesn't please the NDP, but they'll put lipstick on a pig and say it's a win anyways. Or it's perhaps something that resembles the dental care plan. But then you would kind of have to get the provinces to allow you to do this. So in either case, I don't know how anybody will be able to come out of this and say, woohoo, victory for us.
I did read somewhere, I can't remember where, an option of reducing prices on some key drugs that you would allow across the country.
They've already agreed to do that.
Oh,
that's already in there. So that's not
what
that won't work. Yeah.
That's not what this plan should be about or would be about. Right. The other thing is they will obviously miss their deadline. There is no way you can get legislation through the Senate before a year is done.
Yeah. Okay. Last word to you, Andrew. Then I gotta go.
Well, what can be done and what perhaps should be done is to close the gaps in the system. There are lots of reports about self-employed people who get unemployed, that aren't the working poor, et cetera. You can cover those gaps without it being a full-blown first dollar, universal single-payer system. So, more Obamacare than the universals.
But the NDP doesn't want that, and they've made it clear that what they want is the creation of a new system. And right now, if the Liberals are making decisions based on 6 months, 18 months, 24 months, because they assume they were going to have an election in the fall of 2025, they can't really afford to give the NDP absolutely nothing, knowing that Jagmeet Singh has put that red line.
But the gap idea might make a difference and might get them where they need to be. Okay, we'll talk about.
Well, that's the Bill Morneau plan that they rejected.
But times have changed. Who's Bill Morneau now? Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all very much, Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. And that is that issue for this week. Don't forget, you can catch The National on YouTube, CBC Gem. You can catch me on Rosemary Barton Live Sundays at 10 a.m. Eastern. Thanks so much for watching.